The 5-gallon pots grew the biggest plants, but they did not win every test. I grew the same 15 food crops in 3-gallon and 5-gallon containers, using the same potting mix, the same sunlight, and the same basic care. Some crops clearly turned the extra root space into more food. Others mainly produced more leaves, used more soil, and gave almost no meaningful advantage at harvest. By the end, the answer was not simply that bigger pots were better. The crops separated into 3 very different groups. Those that strongly benefited from 5 gallons, those that could work in 3 gallons with a few trade-offs, and those that gave me little reason to use the larger container at all. The comparison included cherry tomatoes, dwarf peppers, compact eggplant, bush cucumbers, bush beans, okra, potatoes, Swiss chard, kale, leaf lettuce, radishes, baby carrots, green onions, basil, and strawberries. That mix mattered because these plants do not use containers in the same way. A tomato can build a large canopy and feed clusters of fruit for a long period. A radish may finish its entire crop before its roots come close to filling the pot. Potatoes need space to form tubers below the soil. Lettuce can be harvested while it is still relatively young. Basil responds strongly to repeated cutting. Strawberries may stay compact but remain in the container for a long time. If one pot size worked equally well for every crop, this would have been a very short test. It did not. Each comparison started with plants of similar size and age. The containers were filled with the same potting mix and placed where both rows received comparable light. The same basic feeding approach was used, and the containers all had open drainage holes. I also rotated positions so one row did not receive the easiest side of the garden every day. The only planned difference was the volume of the container. The smaller pots held 3 gallons of mix, while the larger pots held 5. That means the larger containers offered 2 additional gallons of root space and moisture storage for every plant. Watering needed a slightly different rule. Giving every container exactly the same amount of water would have looked fair, but it would not have been fair to the plants. A 3-gallon pot and a 5-gallon pot do not hold moisture for the same amount of time, especially after the canopy becomes large. So I watered according to the condition of the soil and the needs of the plant, then treated watering frequency as part of the result. If the smaller pot needed attention much more often, that counted as a real cost. If the larger pot stayed evenly moist but did not produce more food, that also mattered. The goal was not to force both containers through the same schedule. The goal was to find out what each size demanded and what it returned. I followed more than plant height. Height can be useful, but it can also be misleading. A plant can be tall and leafy while producing less food than a shorter, better balanced plant. I watched canopy width, leaf quality, flowering, fruit set, the timing of the first usable harvest, the size and consistency of the edible portion, the ability to keep producing after harvest, and the condition of the roots at the end. I also looked at 2 different versions of yield. The first was simple yield per plant. The second was yield relative to the amount of soil used. Those 2 measurements did not always point to the same winner. During the first part of the experiment, the labels on the pots showed a clearer difference than the plants themselves. Small lettuce plants looked almost identical. The first leaves on the radishes and baby carrots did not reveal which container would eventually be more efficient. Basil established quickly in both sizes. Green onions stood upright in both rows. Even several of the fruiting crops spent the early period building roots and new leaves without showing a dramatic difference above the soil. If the test had ended there, it would have been easy to say that 3 gallons was enough for almost everything. But young plants are not the real test of container volume. At that stage, neither plant has explored all the soil available to it. Light, temperature, transplant quality, and the moisture close to the original root ball can matter more than the outer edges of the pot. The real separation began when the roots reached farther, the leaves expanded, and warm conditions increased the demand for water. That was the moment the containers stopped being passive holders and started shaping the daily experience of the plants. The first important difference was not fruit size or plant height. It was how quickly the soil dried. The 3-gallon pots had less mix to store water, and once the plants developed larger canopies, they could move through that supply quickly. On mild days, the difference was manageable. Under stronger sun, several of the smaller pots went from comfortably moist to noticeably dry much faster than the 5-gallon pots beside them. That did not mean every plant in a 3-gallon container immediately struggled. It meant the margin for error became smaller. This is one of the most important lessons from the test. A pot can be large enough for the roots in a technical sense and still be inconvenient because it cannot hold enough moisture for the plant through a hot afternoon. Container size affects more than physical root room. It affects how stable the root zone remains. A larger volume of mix changes temperature more slowly, holds a broader reserve of water, and usually gives the gardener more time before a small delay becomes visible stress. The 3-gallon pots saved soil and space, but some of them began charging for that savings in the form of extra attention. Basil showed the difference quickly because its leaf area expanded fast. Both plants remained productive, but the smaller container moved from moist to dry more abruptly. Swiss chard also made the difference easy to see. Its broad leaves could lose a surprising amount of water, and the plant in the smaller pot was more likely to soften during the hottest part of the day. The cucumber was even more demanding. Once it began building a dense set of leaves and flowers, the smaller root zone had much less reserve. The tomato and eggplant were not far behind. Okra tolerated heat well, but a heat-tolerant plant is not the same as a plant that never needs water. As the stems thickened and the leaves enlarged, the 5-gallon pot gave it a steadier base. Not every afternoon droop meant permanent damage. Some plants recovered soon after watering and continued growing. But repeated swings between very moist and very dry conditions can affect flowering, fruit development, nutrient movement, and the overall balance of the plant. The smaller containers could still succeed, but they required closer timing. That made the next question more important than simple appearance. Would the extra watering keep the smaller pots competitive, or would the restricted reserve eventually reduce the harvest? Flowering changed the comparison because the plants were no longer using resources only to build stems and leaves. They now had to support reproduction, and that made differences in moisture stability and root space more meaningful. The fruiting crops were the clearest place to see that shift, but they did not all respond in the same way. The cherry tomato made one of the strongest arguments for the 5-gallon container. Both plants grew, flowered, and set fruit, so the 3-gallon pot was not a failure. The difference was in how much support the plant needed and how steadily it could continue. In the smaller container, the canopy demanded water faster, the soil changed condition more quickly, and the plant had less room to recover from a delayed watering. The larger container maintained a more even root environment. That showed up not only in the size of the plant, but in the way it carried developing clusters while continuing to form new growth. The smaller tomato could still produce an acceptable crop when watering was watched carefully. That point matters because many gardeners already own 3-gallon pots and do not need to throw them away. A compact cherry tomato can live and produce in that volume, but in this comparison, the 5-gallon plant was easier to keep balanced and better able to continue producing without the same level of daily attention. The extra soil was not merely supporting decorative leaves, it was helping the plant maintain a larger fruiting system for longer. For cherry tomatoes, the larger pot earned its space. The dwarf pepper produced a more complicated answer. Because the plant was naturally compact, both containers remained manageable. The 5-gallon pepper developed a broader root zone and generally held its condition more steadily between waterings. It also had more freedom to branch and carry fruit without the root area drying as sharply. But the advantage was not as dramatic as it was with the tomato. The 3-gallon plant still flowered, set peppers, and remained a realistic option for a small patio. This is where the difference between better and necessary becomes useful. 5 gallons was better for the pepper when the goal was maximum stability and the longest possible production period. 3 gallons was still workable when space was limited and the gardener could monitor moisture. The larger container provided a cushion. It did not transform the dwarf pepper into an entirely different plant. For that crop, The decision depended more on convenience and season length than on a clear pass-or-fail threshold. The compact eggplant moved much closer to the tomato side of the test. Eggplant leaves are large, and the plant must support relatively heavy fruit compared with its compact root zone. Both plants established, but as flowering and fruit development increased, the smaller container became more demanding. The plant could look fine in the morning and lose firmness later as the root zone dried. That fluctuation did not always stop production, but it made the plant less consistent. In 5 gallons, the eggplant held a stronger frame and had a more stable supply of moisture while fruit was filling. The result was not simply a taller plant. The larger pot better matched the crop's combination of broad leaves, warm weather growth, and heavy fruit. The compact label can tempt gardeners to assume that a very small container is automatically sufficient. Compact describes the top growth compared with a standard variety. It does not mean the plant has no need for a dependable root zone. In this comparison, the 5-gallon pot was the more reliable home for the eggplant. The bush cucumber made the case even more clearly. Bush describes a shorter, more contained growth habit, but cucumbers still move a great deal of water through their leaves. They can go from vigorous to stressed quickly when the root zone dries. The 3-gallon cucumber grew and produced, but it had the narrowest margin of error among the compact fruiting crops. Once flowering became heavy and young cucumbers were developing, the smaller container demanded frequent checks. The 5-gallon cucumber stayed more even. Its leaves maintained better firmness through the day, and the plant had a steadier base for carrying flowers and fruit at the same time. A bush cucumber does not need the enormous root area of a full-size vining plant grown in the ground, but it still benefits from more than a minimal reservoir. Here, the additional soil was doing real work. It reduced stress and supported continued production. The 3-gallon pot could be used in a tightly managed setup, but the 5-gallon pot was the safer and more productive recommendation. Okra brought a different personality to the test. It enjoys heat, stands upright, and often appears tougher than cucumber or tomato. Early in the comparison, that toughness made the two plants look more similar than expected, but as the stems thickened and the plants began forming pods, the difference in root volume became more important. The 5-gallon okra had more room to anchor itself and a larger reserve of moisture during hot conditions. The 3-gallon plant was capable of producing pods, especially when kept from drying too severely. Still, it reached the limits of the smaller root zone sooner. Okra is often grown as a substantial plant, even when a compact variety is chosen. A container that looks adequate during the seedling stage can become restrictive once the plant reaches its productive frame. In this trial, 5 gallons made more sense for okra, not because the smaller pot produced nothing, but because the larger pot supported the crop with less stress and more consistent production. When the 5 fruiting crops were considered together, the pattern was already becoming clear. Cherry tomatoes, compact eggplant, bush cucumbers, and okra made strong use of the added volume. Dwarf peppers benefited too, but the smaller pot remained a practical option. That difference is important for a gardener trying to allocate limited space. The question is not whether 5 gallons can improve a crop. It often can. The better question is whether the improvement is large enough to justify replacing another pot, using more mix, and taking more floor space. The fruiting plants also revealed why measuring only the first harvest would have been misleading. A smaller container may produce an early tomato, pepper, or cucumber at nearly the same time as a larger one. The difference often grows later, when the plant must keep supporting old fruit, new flowers, expanding leaves, and a root system operating in warm soil. The larger pot can extend the period during which all those demands remain balanced. That means the value of 5 gallons may appear more clearly in continued production than in the first fruit pick. At this point, the larger pots seemed to be building a strong lead, but the next group changed the test because the edible portion was developing below the soil. A large canopy could be useful, useless, or even deceptive. For potatoes, radishes, and baby carrots, the real question was not which plant looked more impressive. It was how much usable food formed inside the container, and whether the additional soil was actually occupied. Potatoes were the root crop most likely to benefit from the larger container, although the reason was different from the fruiting plants. A potato plant needs enough moisture to keep its top growth healthy, but it also needs usable volume where tubers can form without severe crowding. The 5-gallon pot offered more of both. Its larger mass of mix changed moisture more slowly, and it provided a broader area for developing potatoes. The 3-gallon potato plant could still make tubers. It was not an empty pot with a decorative top, but the smaller volume limited how much room existed below the surface, and it left less buffer when the canopy was drawing water strongly. The difference became especially meaningful near the period when the plant was actively filling tubers. Repeated drying at that stage can interrupt steady development, while a crowded root and tuber zone can produce a crop that is less consistent in size. The 5-gallon container did not turn potatoes into a space-free crop. It still used more mix, and potatoes can use containers larger than 5 gallons when the goal is maximum yield. But within this direct comparison, 5 gallons was the more sensible choice. The extra soil supported more usable underground space, not simply a larger display of leaves. For potatoes, the added volume had a clear job and a clear return. Radishes produced almost the opposite lesson. They grow quickly, occupy the upper portion of the soil, and can be harvested before their roots explore a large container. Both pot sizes provided enough depth for the varieties used in the test. The important factors were spacing, even moisture, and avoiding conditions that encouraged excessive leaf growth without good root formation. A 5-gallon pot could hold more plants if its surface area was greater, but when the comparison was based on an equivalent planting arrangement, the extra depth and volume did not automatically create better radishes. The 3-gallon pot gave the roots the room they needed and reached harvest without demanding the full reserve of the larger container. This is exactly the kind of crop that can make a 5-gallon pot inefficient when only a small planting is used. The bigger container may stay moist longer, but much of its soil can remain lightly explored by the time the radishes are ready. For a gardener trying to save potting mix, radishes offered one of the clearest reasons to keep the 3-gallon container. That does not mean container size is irrelevant. A shallow pot with poor drainage can still produce disappointing radishes, and overcrowding can reduce root size in any volume. The lesson is more specific. Once adequate depth, drainage, and surface spacing are available, adding 2 more gallons below a quick radish crop may provide little practical benefit. The crop finishes before the larger reserve becomes necessary. Baby carrots told a similar story, but depth and shape mattered more. A container labeled 3 gallons can be short and wide or relatively deep. Carrots care about the vertical path available to the root, not only the number printed on the pot. In this comparison, both containers offered enough usable depth for baby carrots. That allowed the smaller pot to remain competitive. The 5-gallon pot held moisture more steadily, which helped maintain even growth. But the baby carrots did not require the same broad, long-term root system as tomato, cucumber, or eggplant. When planted at an appropriate density, the 3-gallon container produced a useful crop without needing all the additional soil. The larger pot could become more productive if its greater surface area was planted with more carrots, but that would change the experiment from a pot volume comparison into a population comparison. This distinction matters for anyone planning a balcony garden. A larger container can produce more total food simply because it can hold more individual plants. That does not prove each plant needed the extra root volume. When the goal is to decide whether a crop requires 5 gallons, plant count and surface area must be separated from the effect of the deeper soil reserve. For baby carrots, adequate depth and sensible spacing were more important than moving automatically from 3 to 5 gallons. Together, the underground crops exposed the difference between having more soil and actually using enough of it to justify the extra volume. Potatoes use the added space in a meaningful way. Radishes usually finish too quickly to take advantage of it. Baby carrots benefited from stable moisture, but a properly shaped 3-gallon pot already offered enough room for the smaller roots. The visual size of the top growth could not replace the final underground comparison. The next group changed the calculation again. Swiss chard, kale, leaf lettuce, green onions, and basil could be harvested repeatedly or harvested young. That meant the plants did not always need to reach their maximum possible size. A gardener could begin taking food while the root system was still modest. In this group, the winner depended heavily on whether the goal was one early harvest, repeated cutting, or the longest possible production period. Swiss chard was the largest and thirstiest member of this leafy group. Its broad leaves and substantial stems allowed the 5-gallon plant to use the extra moisture reserve. The larger container supported a fuller plant and made repeated leaf removal easier to recover from. The 3-gallon chard still produced useful leaves, but it required closer watering and reached a practical size limit sooner. For a gardener who wanted one chard plant to remain productive for a long season, 5 gallons offered a real advantage. For someone harvesting smaller leaves, keeping the plant compact, or growing several crops in limited space, 3 gallons could still work. The smaller pot was not ideal for neglect, but it was capable. Swiss chard belonged in the middle category. The larger pot was helpful and could improve long-term performance. Yet the smaller pot remained a realistic choice with attentive care. Kale responded in a related way, although its water use was less dramatic than the cucumber and its structure was easier to manage than the chard. Both plants produced leaves. The 5-gallon kale developed more reserve for continued growth, especially as older outer leaves were harvested and the center kept producing. It also tolerated short delays in watering more comfortably, but 3 gallons supported a compact kale plant well enough for regular harvests of smaller leaves. When the plant was not expected to grow into a large, long-lived specimen, the smaller pot used space efficiently. The extra volume in the 5-gallon container became more valuable with time. If the crop was kept for an extended season, the larger root zone helped. If the goal was baby leaves or a shorter harvest window, the 3-gallon pot was often sufficient. Leaf lettuce was one of the strongest examples of a crop that did not need the larger pot for the way it was harvested. Lettuce has a relatively shallow root system, and it can be cut as individual leaves or harvested as a young plant before the roots occupy a large volume. Both containers supported healthy growth when moisture was kept even. The 5-gallon pot stayed moist longer, but the lettuce did not convert all that extra reserve into a proportionally larger edible return. The 3-gallon container reached a useful harvest efficiently. It used less mix, took less floor space, and still allowed repeated leaf cutting. In very hot conditions, the larger pot could slow moisture swings, but container volume could not solve the larger problem of heat stress or bolting by itself. Shade timing, temperature, variety, and harvest stage remained important. For ordinary leaf lettuce production, the smaller container was enough. Green onions made the advantage of surface use even clearer. They can grow in clusters, their roots do not require a massive volume, and they can be harvested gradually. The 5-gallon container offered a larger moisture reserve, but a 3-gallon pot with appropriate spacing already provided a practical growing environment. The crop did not need a deep, broad root zone in the same way as tomato or potato. What mattered most was using the top area efficiently. A larger pot could hold a larger cluster if it also had a wider surface. But again, that would be a benefit of planting more onions. Not evidence that each onion required 5 gallons. For a small group of green onions, the 3-gallon pot was an easy recommendation. It delivered useful food without tying up a larger container that could be reserved for a more demanding crop. Basil was more interesting because it can begin as a modest herb and become a substantial branching plant after repeated pinching. Early harvests were easy in both sizes. The 3-gallon basil produced plenty of usable leaves and responded well when the growing tips were cut. As the season continued, the 5-gallon plant had more room to develop a broad framework and recover from heavier harvests. It also maintained moisture more evenly during warm periods. The larger pot therefore produced a larger long-term plant, but that did not automatically make it the best choice for every garden. A household harvesting modest amounts of basil could get excellent value from 3 gallons. A gardener planning to cut large bunches repeatedly, make frequent batches of pesto, or maintain one plant for a long warm season would appreciate the 5-gallon reserve. In the basic comparison, 3 gallons was enough for useful basil production. 5 gallons was an optional upgrade for scale and convenience. This group revealed why the first cutting could not determine the winner. A lettuce plant may be mostly finished before root restriction matters. Chard, kale, and basil can be asked to replace harvested growth many times. The longer the plant remains in the pot, the more valuable additional root volume can become. Container recommendations should therefore include not only the crop name but the intended harvest style. A gardener growing baby kale for a few cuttings has different needs from a gardener maintaining a mature kale plant through a long season. By this point, several 5-gallon pots had clearly earned their place, while several leafy and quick crops had shown that the smaller container could be more efficient. Two comparisons remained: bush beans and strawberries. Both could produce over a period of time, but neither behaved exactly like the larger fruiting crops. Bush beans grew quickly and moved from leaves to flowers and pods without needing a very long season. The plants in both containers were capable of flowering and producing beans. The 5-gallon pot provided steadier moisture and more room for the roots, but the value of that extra volume depended on how many bean plants were placed in the container. A larger surface can support more plants, yet overcrowding can erase the benefit by increasing competition. With equivalent planting pressure, the 3-gallon container performed well enough to remain practical. Bush beans do not build the same long-lasting woody framework as eggplant, or carry the same continuous water demand as cucumber. They can complete a productive cycle before severe root restriction becomes the central problem. The smaller pot did require attention during flowering and pod filling, because dry soil at that stage could reduce performance. Still, 3 gallons was generally sufficient for a modest planting. The 5-gallon bean container was easier to keep evenly moist and offered more flexibility if the plants were allowed to grow larger. But its advantage was not strong enough to make it mandatory. For a garden focused on yield per square foot, several appropriately planted smaller containers could compete very well with fewer large ones. Bush beans therefore leaned toward the 3-gallon side, provided plant count and watering were managed sensibly. Strawberries produced another result that depended on how the container was used. A single strawberry plant does not need 5 gallons of soil to establish, flower, and produce fruit. The 3-gallon pot gave one plant enough room and was easier to place along a railing, step, or sunny edge. The 5-gallon pot stayed moist longer and could support a larger planting or a plant kept for multiple seasons. But much of its volume was unnecessary for one young plant. The larger strawberry plant could develop more leaves and runners, yet runners are not the same as fruit yield. In fact, allowing too much energy to move into runners can reduce the attention available for fruit. Container size did not replace the need to manage the plant's growth. For a single productive strawberry plant, 3 gallons was enough. 5 gallons became more useful when several plants shared a broad container, when the planting was intended to remain for a long period, or when moisture stability was the main priority. Now the visible growth comparisons were complete, but appearance alone could still lead to the wrong conclusion. The 5-gallon row contained more large plants. It was also more forgiving when watering was delayed. Yet it had used substantially more potting mix across 15 crops and occupied more space. The final judgment needed to combine 4 things: the usable harvest, the length of production, the daily care required, and how much soil was used to achieve the result. Looking across the complete harvest record, the 5-gallon containers produced more total food overall. That was expected because several of the highest demand crops benefited strongly from the added volume. But the advantage was concentrated rather than universal. Tomato, eggplant, cucumber, okra, and potatoes accounted for much of the reason to choose the larger size. For quick roots, small leafy crops, herbs, and compact plantings, the additional soil often returned a smaller benefit. This is why a single total for the entire garden can be misleading. If one large tomato produces a noticeable increase, it can make the 5-gallon row look dominant even when lettuce, radishes, green onions, and strawberries gained very little from the same upgrade. Garden planning happens one crop at a time. The best container strategy is not to give every plant the same large pot. It is to reserve the largest useful containers for the plants capable of exploiting them. The first way to judge the results was yield per plant. By that measure, 5 gallons had a clear advantage for the crops that built large canopies, carried heavy fruit, or needed room below the soil. This was useful for a gardener who wanted the greatest possible return from one plant and had enough room for larger containers. But yield per plant did not answer the question faced by many balcony and patio growers. They were not choosing between two pots in an empty field. They were deciding how to use a fixed amount of space and a limited supply of potting mix. The second way to judge the results was efficiency per gallon of soil. The 5-gallon pot used about 2/3 more mix than the 3-gallon pot. For the upgrade to be equally efficient, the crop needed to return a meaningful increase, not simply a few more leaves or a slightly larger plant. Tomato, cucumber, eggplant, okra, and potatoes came closest to justifying that increase because their growth and harvest demands continued long enough to use the larger reserve. Several smaller crops did not. Leaf lettuce was productive before it needed the full volume. Radishes completed their crop in the upper part of the container. Green onions used surface area more than deep soil. Baby carrots needed adequate depth, but not necessarily 5 gallons. Basil gave useful repeated harvests in 3 gallons, even though a larger plant could be built in 5. A single strawberry plant had no reason to occupy the larger container unless long-term moisture stability or multiple plants were part of the plan. Bush beans also remained competitive in the smaller size when the planting density was appropriate. The third measure was labor. This changed some recommendations even when harvest differences were modest. A 3-gallon pot can be efficient with soil and space, but inefficient with a gardener's time. If it needs to be checked constantly during warm weather, the smaller container may not be the best choice for someone away from home through the day. The 5-gallon pot offered a larger safety margin. It could remain productive through a slightly longer interval between waterings, and that reliability had real value. This is why two gardeners can look at the same results and make different decisions without either one being wrong. A gardener with automatic irrigation may prefer more 3-gallon pots because moisture can be delivered consistently. A gardener watering by hand after work may value the 5-gallon reserve. Someone with a narrow balcony may choose compact pots and accept smaller individual plants. Someone with a large patio may prioritize maximum production from each tomato, cucumber, eggplant, or okra plant. The right pot size depends on what resource is most limited: soil, floor space, water, time, or the number of plants. The timing of the harvest also mattered. Some smaller containers reached the first usable harvest without an obvious delay. That could make them look equal early in the season, but the difference appeared later when the crop had to continue producing. A larger root zone could support new flowers while existing fruit was filling, or replace leaves after repeated cutting. This is why the value of 5 gallons increased for long-season fruiting plants and mature leafy plants. The pot was not necessarily buying an earlier start. It was buying more stability and a longer productive window. For fast crops, the opposite was true. A radish does not need a long productive window. Leaf lettuce may be harvested before heat arrives. Green onions can be removed gradually. Baby carrots can finish while the root system is still modest. In these cases, the plant's calendar ended before the 5-gallon advantage had time to become important. The best pot was not the one with the greatest theoretical capacity. It was the one that matched the crop's actual life in the garden. After the harvest comparisons, the containers were removed so the root systems could explain the patterns. This final check was important because roots can reveal pressure that is not obvious in the leaves. A plant may look acceptable while its roots are circling densely around the sides, searching every available pocket of mix. Another plant may look large while leaving broad sections of the larger root ball only lightly explored. The tomato roots in the 3-gallon container had occupied the available volume much more completely. The root system had built a dense relationship with the entire pot, which helped explain why moisture changed so quickly. In the 5-gallon container, the roots had more room to spread and a larger mass of mix surrounding them. That did not make the plant immune to drought, but it created a more stable working area. The roots confirmed that the tomato was not merely reacting above the soil, it had genuinely used the additional space. The cucumber showed a similar need for reserve, although its root pattern reflected its own rapid, thirsty growth. the smaller pot had little unused capacity by the time production was active. The 5-gallon root zone better matched the plant's high water movement. Eggplant and okra also showed that the extra volume had not been wasted. Their roots had expanded far enough for the larger container to contribute to stability and sustained growth. The potato comparison revealed a different use of space. Roots, stems, and developing tubers shared the underground volume. In the smaller container, usable room was naturally more limited. The larger pot allowed a broader distribution below the surface. It still was not an unlimited potato system, but it gave the crop a more appropriate working volume. The underground evidence supported the harvest recommendation. 5 gallons was the better minimum among the two choices. The quick crops told another story. Radish roots had completed their work without exploring the full depth of the larger pot. The extra soil remained available, but availability alone did not create value. The lettuce root system was healthy, without needing the full 5 gallons. Green onions remained relatively contained. The baby carrots used their vertical paths, but did not require a broad, long-season root network. These root systems confirmed that the smaller containers had not been forcing the plants through severe restriction before harvest. Basil, kale, and Swiss chard fell between the two extremes. Their roots could use additional space if the plants were kept growing and harvested repeatedly. The 5-gallon pots offered a better long-term home, but the 3-gallon roots were capable of supporting useful production. These were not crops with one universal answer. Their category depended on how large the gardener wanted them to become and how long they were expected to remain productive. Bush beans and strawberries also showed why plant count must be considered. The roots of one strawberry plant did not require the same volume as one tomato. A large container became useful when it held several strawberry plants or was maintained over a longer period. Bush beans could fill more of the pot when several plants shared the surface, but increasing plant number also increased competition. The correct recommendation had to describe the planting arrangement, not only the crop name. With growth, watering, harvest, and root evidence combined, the 15 crops finally separated into 3 practical groups. The first group strongly benefited from 5 gallons. The second could work in 3 gallons, but gained useful stability or longevity from 5. The third gave little reason to use the larger container under the planting style in this test. The crops in the first group were cherry tomatoes, compact eggplant, bush cucumbers, okra, and potatoes. All 5 could survive and produce in 3 gallons when care was close, but 5 gallons provided a clear enough benefit to become the stronger recommendation. These plants either carried a heavy fruit load, moved through water quickly, remained productive for a long period, or needed meaningful underground space. For them, the added mix was not sitting unused. It improved the working environment around the roots and supported a more dependable harvest. Cherry tomatoes benefited from the larger reserve because the plant was expected to support leaves, flowers, green fruit, and ripening fruit at the same time. Compact eggplants needed stability, while broad leaves and heavy fruit competed for water. Bush cucumbers may have been shorter than vining types, but their moisture demand remained high. Okra used the deeper, steadier root zone as the plant matured. Potatoes used the volume for both moisture and tuber development. If only a few 5-gallon containers were available, these were the crops that deserved them first. The second group included dwarf peppers, Swiss chard, and kale. 3 gallons could produce a useful crop, but 5 gallons offered benefits that became more important over time. Dwarf peppers remained compact enough to function in the smaller pot, yet the larger root zone reduced moisture swings and supported a longer production period. Swiss chard could be harvested successfully in 3 gallons, but repeated leaf removal and regrowth made the larger reserve valuable. Kale followed the same pattern, especially when maintained as a mature plant rather than harvested young. The third group included bush beans, leaf lettuce, radishes, baby carrots, green onions, basil, and strawberries under the planting arrangement used here. 3 gallons provided enough useful root space for these crops to produce well. 5 gallons could still offer convenience, hold more plants when the surface was wider, or support longer-term growth, but the individual crop did not consistently turn the extra 2 gallons into a proportional advantage. Bush beans could complete a productive cycle in the smaller container when the number of plants was controlled. Leaf lettuce could be harvested before the larger volume became necessary. Radishes used the upper soil and finished quickly. Baby carrots needed sufficient depth and loose mix more than a 5-gallon label. Green onions used surface spacing efficiently. Basil produced repeated usable cuttings in 3 gallons, even though a larger pot could grow a larger plant. A single strawberry plant had ample room in 3 gallons, while 5 gallons made more sense for multiple plants or a long-term planting. This final group should not be interpreted as a claim that 5 gallons harms these crops. Larger containers are usually more forgiving with moisture, and a wider pot can hold more plants. The conclusion is about necessity and efficiency. When a crop already has enough root space to complete the harvest you want, using a larger container may reduce the number of other crops your garden can hold. That trade can be worthwhile, but it should be intentional. The overall winner therefore depended on the question. If the question was which row produced the most total food from one plant in each pot, the 5-gallon row came out ahead because the demanding crops made strong use of the added volume. If the question was which pot used each gallon of mix most efficiently, several 3-gallon crops became the better choice. If the question was which pot required less frequent attention, 5 gallons usually had the advantage. One experiment produced 3 different answers, because yield, efficiency, and convenience are not the same thing. For a small space garden, the most productive strategy was a mixed system. Use 5-gallon pots for the plants that need a stable root zone and have the ability to produce over a long period. Use 3-gallon pots for quick crops, compact herbs, and smaller plantings that will be harvested before the roots become crowded. This approach creates more food than giving every plant the same size container, because it directs soil and floor space toward the crops that can return the greatest benefit. The most reliable way to choose is to consider 4 questions. How large and long-lived will the plant become? How quickly will it use water? How much of the edible crop develops below the soil? And how often can you realistically check the container? A plant that is large, thirsty, long season, or producing substantial underground food deserves more volume. A plant that is compact, quick, shallow-rooted, or harvested young can often use a smaller pot efficiently. So, did 5 gallons yield more? Overall, yes, but mainly because the most demanding crops used the additional space well. Did every crop need 5 gallons? No. Several produced useful, efficient harvests in 3 gallons, and some gave almost no reason to spend the extra soil. The best result did not come from choosing one pot size for the entire garden. It came from matching the container to the crop. Reserve 5 gallons first for cherry tomatoes, compact eggplant, bush cucumbers, okra, and potatoes. Consider either size for dwarf peppers, Swiss chard, and kale, depending on season length and watering. Use 3 gallons confidently for modest plantings of bush beans, leaf lettuce, radishes, baby carrots, green onions, basil, and individual strawberries. Then adjust for your climate, container shape, variety, and irrigation routine. Before buying a larger container, ask what problem you are trying to solve. Do you need more physical root room, a larger moisture reserve, a longer production season, or simply a better watering routine? A larger pot is worth using only when the crop can turn that additional soil into a benefit you actually need. More food, more stability, or less daily attention. That is the real difference between choosing the biggest pot available and choosing the right pot for the garden you have.